Hello, everyone. Yeah, this works. So give it a minute or just it good? Okay, hello, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Douglas Hamilton, coming from North Carolina State, where Douglas Hamilton has a position of assistant professor. Their undergraduate degree is from University East Anglia and PhD from University of Leeds. Then Dr. Hamilton had postdoc at Cornell, the group of Natalie Mahawelt, and this is actually where we met. Their work is on aerosols from understanding the role of aerosols from wildfires and specifically metal aerosols such as iron and their impacts on biochemical cycles. And today we will hear more about this. So one of the things that I want to say about Douglas that there are well-known experts on wildfires and actually listed at AGU as an expert on wildfires on their website. And also they have published about 8 or even more papers on Nature in the last 4 years. So Mike is to you now.
Okay. Thanks. Yeah, I guess on to that last bit. Yeah, wildfires are a hot topic, so there's a lot of interest for sure out there, if you don't mind the use of the pun there. So thank you everybody for coming today and inviting me here to talk to you. As Diana was saying, today I'm going to talk to you broadly about the impact of aerosols on ocean biogeochemical cycles, and it will have a particular focus later on the wildfire aspect, which is a kind of a new dimension to thinking about this particular system coupling. So most of the talk will be based around this schematic here. So when I'm talking about aerosols, I'm mainly talking about the emissions from the land surface as a nutrient source. So in particular, we're going to be thinking about dust, wildfires, and anthropogenic components as well through fossil fuel burning. And then it's their transport through the atmosphere. And while they're in their atmosphere, they actually do interact with the radiation as well and cause all sorts of interesting climate feedbacks, which we won't be going into today because we're interested in the final part, which is what happens to them once they enter the ocean. So from the surface of the land, their transport through the atmosphere, and then the deposition to different marine regions. So aware that I'm coming to talk to a oceanography group, so I thought I would just start with one of the beautiful animations from NASA, in fact, which is very relevant, since we're here, which shows aerosols from a wide variety of different sources and where they're coming from and how they get transported through the atmosphere, just to give you a top-level kind of conceptualization. So we've got a wide variety of different aerosols here listed out on the right-hand side. In particular, pay attention to something like here, this orange plume. So that's desert dust, that's mineral aerosols coming out from North Africa. In the red, particularly around South America and South Africa, that's wildfires, that's smoke coming out there. We also have this particular plume here. So the time coverage here is actually capturing the mega fire which happened in Australia in the summer of 2019-2020. So keep your eye on that because there's going to be a very large plume coming out from there. In fact, here it is starting to come here. And other aerosol sources as well. In the pinks up here in the northern hemisphere, particularly around East China, Europe and America, we have fossil fuel burning, and then sea spray aerosols as well, which are very nice. They kind of come out in these lovely circular motions here. So, and now we've got, just coming out now, this is a very, very large plume of smoke aerosol, which was coming out from this mega fire event that was happening. And we'll come to that later in the talk as a case study for some of the impacts of that on the ocean biogeochemistry of the South Pacific. Okay, so today's talk we split up into 3 different sections. Give a general overview of aerosols in biogeochemical cycles, a little bit about how we can model some of this, in particular the modeling of the nutrient iron from an atmospheric point of view, and then finally this case study on wildfires as a source of nutrient aerosol. So I want to start just by kind of going back to the very beginning of the science here when we're thinking about aerosols as that source of nutrients. And it goes back to the late 80s with the work of Robert Douce and John Martin. And this is a very infamous quote by Martin, which is, give me half a tank of iron and I'll give you the next ice age. And what he was doing there when he was talking about this was he's trying to unpick why there was a large CO2 change at the change of the deglaciation, which had been confounding scientists for a long time. And his hypothesis was, in fact, that it was iron from dust from that drier climate, which was entering into the marine ecosystems, which was then causing the phytoplankton blooms, which then caused the CO2 drawdown. I don't know if he ever intended this, but it certainly spurred an awful lot of research in the last 20 to 30 years. In particular, this question of how far nutrients and dust can actually fertilize phytoplankton and impact global biogeochemical cycles is a real transdisciplinary question as well. So it has to bring in all sorts of different people from all sorts of fields, not just ocean folk and the biogeochemistry there, but from the atmosphere, from the land surface, from the paleo, from looking at this at very many different aspects, which is, from my point of view, why I particularly find this topic so fascinating to work in, because it really is such a transdisciplinary question. Okay, so the cycle. What are we thinking about when I'm saying aerosols and marine biogeochemical cycles? So if we start up at the top left here, in the first instance, we have the nutrient aerosols themselves. So they're from a wide variety of sources. We saw some of them earlier. So they get emitted into the atmosphere. During their lifetime, though, within the atmosphere, a certain portion of insoluble nutrients, which are tightly bound up in things like iron oxide forms, for example, they can actually interact with other constituents of the atmosphere, for example, acidic gases like sulfur dioxide, and that will actually work to liberate some more of the nutrient into a more bioavailable or a bioaccessible form. So at this talk, I'm going to use the words bioavailable and soluble interchangeably, and it's that fraction of the total iron amount, or you could call them phosphorus amount as well, which once deposited to the ocean will be the fraction which the biota can most readily take up. So that's the fraction that we're interested in when we're talking about how much is being deposited to the ocean. So once it gets deposited to the ocean, we then have the question of, well, do the phytoplankton care? Do they want that particular nutrient? Is it going to have a positive response on the ecosystem? Are we going to have a fertilization effect? I'm not going to go into it today very much, but there is also the reverse as well, the toxicology effect. There are other metals also within the aerosol, which can actually cause phytoplankton to die through toxicology. So, for example, copper is one in the high concentrations and can actually cause a decline in productivity. And then finally, what does that mean for the carbon cycle? So the story of today's talk will finish at number 4, but the actual story in terms of the Earth system doesn't actually finish there. So if you do have the fertilization of the biota, so they also produce gases which get then released from the ocean back into the atmosphere. Those gases then readily condense into sulfate aerosols, organic aerosols, which can go on to impact the climate in various different ways through changing cloud processes, precipitation, temperature changes, which can then feed back on those land processes, so they can feed back onto things like fires and dust emissions, and therefore the cycle can keep on going around. So the 3 main nutrient emissions that we're interested in normally in terms of the aerosol are nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron. This is a ternary diagram here which shows the relative contribution of different sources to those 3 different iron aerosol nutrients. What we can see here, if we look at iron, here, total iron amount, that's dominated by the dust source. And also similarly for the total amount of phosphorus which is released to the atmosphere, that's also very much dominated by the dust. In contrast, nitrogen down here is dominated mainly actually by the anthropogenic components, so fossil fuel burning, things, traffic, causing an awful lot of nitrogen. That's all I'm really going to say about nitrogen in today's talk. We're going to then move really on to, like I say, talking about iron. But what's interesting here is that soluble fraction. So I was saying that's the bioavailable component. And if we look at the difference between the total amount that's released and that soluble fraction, we can see here that these other natural sources and anthropogenic sources are contributing as much as dust. So that's why it's important to be considering not just this problem from the dust lens, which has been what's happened for most of the research to date in there, but to start considering these other sources of iron because they do have a large contribution towards the bioavailable part. So what evidence do we have that actually this is important in terms of the biota? So we undertook a literature review where we looked across all of the bioassay experiments that we could find in the literature. Here they are all plotted up here, and what we're looking at is the maximum chlorophyll change upon artificial aerosol addition to seawater at these various different regions for 3 different types of aerosol which have been examined. And the larger the size of your shape, the larger the increase in chlorophyll was. And what we can see that on general, if we have a look across all of the different experiments that have been taken to date, that yes, they would suggest that aerosol addition would in fact fertilize biota. In this particular compilation synthesis, the mean is about 80%, an 80% increase in chlorophyll across all of these different studies. However, these crosses represent where the artificial addition actually had no impact at all. So it's not guaranteed. And in some regions where we have, on one particular study, for example here, you can see there was a very large increase, but then it was done again, and in fact, there's no increase at all. And then occasionally, we also then see that reduction. So the red is the reduction in biota in the chlorophyll that was measured. So there's various different reasons for that. I've listed 3 of them there, but it's really important when we're considering not just the magnitude, therefore, of how much nutrient is getting towards these systems, but also the state of that system as well. And this is where that kind of transdisciplinary kind of knowledge then is really important to understand these 2 different parts of the problem. So that's bioassays. So that's very small. That's people taking a very, very small scale look at what would happen. And we can kind of go slightly larger up into the iron fertilization experiments, as well as I'm trying to understand what particular patterns of nutrients limitation there is across different ocean regions. What we're looking at here is quite a famous plot that I'm guessing quite a lot of people know, and we've updated it here just on the right. So it's the same set of observations, but with what we could find new in literature in the last 10 years. And each dot represents where one of these either large-scale iron fertilization experiments was undertaken or some more kind of larger-scale experiments to see which particular type of nutrient was limiting the phytoplankton growth. And then underneath that, what we're looking at is the concentration of nitrate in the ocean surface. So this is characterized very much by this kind of high nitrate, low chlorophyll, HNLC regions, so where we have high amounts of nitrate in the ocean, that's often where iron is there, the limiting nutrient. And then outside of those regions, it can be nitrogen and phosphorus, which are limiting. But often it's not just down to iron, and if you have a look at the difference between these 2 plots, particularly like the newer observations, these ones here, and the ones down around the Drake Passage here, we can see that there's co-limiting factors. So it's not as simple as just 1 or 2. Sometimes you can have up to 3 different nutrients which could be limiting productivity, and that makes the question even more complex as well, which I'm not going to go into today, I'm just going to focus on iron, but as we're kind of understanding more of the system, we're understanding more of this complexity. Okay, so going up into the atmosphere now. So we know kind of the regions in which iron deposition or other nutrients are going to be important. And And then the question is, okay, well, what have we done to characterize that atmospheric deposition in those open ocean regions where it might likely be important in terms of the biota? This just here is a plot. Don't worry about the colors underneath. It's just the yellow dots that I want to draw your eye to, which is all of the different aerosol characterization, shipborne aerosol characterizations that have been taken over the last 20 to 30 years. So you can see clearly that there's a large cluster of observations have been taken in the Atlantic region, some in the Pacific, but in other regions, for example, the Southern Ocean, there is a sparsity of data. So that really restricts our understanding in those regions to much more limited data profiles, but in part due to, of course, the cost and expense and logistical difficulties in actually sending ships out to these regions. And maybe an easier way to kind of look at it is to agglomerate that over a larger temporal scale. So what we're looking at here is those observations which have been then, it's the median of the observations in the 5 by 5 degree cell. And we can start to see then some more of the patterns in what's missing and where the observations have been taken. And again, we can see that that if we think about this in terms of iron is the most observed, the most characterized, and that's because due to its importance, whereas other nutrients, in particular phosphate actually, as well as reactive nitrogen, have a lot less characterization. So there's work to be done in characterizing different parts of the ocean as well as different times. So this is just a spatial scale here, but in terms of time, these observations are only taken on one day. So we're only capturing a very small snapshot of what's occurring. So repeatability in different seasons is also going to be important, which is missing, again, from the data. But if anybody here has data that you are kind of saying, hey, I've got some data here that isn't kind of shown there, or you know of other data, then I would just like to put a quick advert up for a new group, a new working group from SCORE, which is called Rusted. And one of our tours, one of our terms of reference is to create a database of all of that data for the aerosol iron and make that publicly available in an easy-to-use manner. A lot of this data here, actually, so this all exists on an Excel spreadsheet on my computer from a wide variety of different studies that I've kind of collected over time. There isn't actually too many easy ways to get hold of that data, so we want to try and help the community in doing that, but also we would ask the community to help us. If you know of other data, please reach out to me because it's going to be useful and we'd like to add it to the database. Okay, so that's from the observational side of things. Actually, I normally more sit in the modeling world. And what I undertook during my postdoc when I was with Diana at Cornell was to actually model the iron cycle within an Earth system model. So the model that I use is the Community Earth System model, so NCARS model. The NCAR CSM model contains various different components of the Earth system, including the land, the atmosphere, the ocean, sea ice, and rivers. And they all talk to each other via a coupler. And what's nice about this iron module is that it's really helping to couple what's happening in terms of the Earth system between the land and the atmosphere and the ocean. So it's a really nice, powerful way to use an Earth system model towards its absolute maximum extent. The module itself includes iron emissions currently from dust fires and anthropogenic, and we're working to add volcanoes into that as well. They can be another large source of nutrients. I was saying earlier about this iron processing within the atmosphere. It represents both acidic and organic iron processing. And then finally, it's got the two dry deposition and wet deposition processes, so the loss of that atmosphere to the ocean surface. So just very briefly, I want to talk to you about the three different sources of iron that are in there currently and what we have to think about in terms of what that means. So for dust, it's really due to the characteristics of the parent soil. And that's due to then the mineral content of that soil. So here we've got 9 different minerals that you can find in soils and their fractional contribution. And you can see that there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity there between the different soil characteristics. So that's a really important component when we're thinking about what the composition of that what the composition of that dust is. And each of these minerals contains a different content of iron. So for example, something like hematite, which is an iron oxide, that contains a really large amount of iron. It's up to like 60% iron there, whereas other ones, things like calcite and quartz don't contain any at all. So from the iron question, we're really very interested in hematite. We're also interested in the clays as well, but we may not be interested so much in other mineralogical components. There is a NASA project which was launched recently called EMIT, which is using I believe it's called a spectrometer on the space station, and that's helping to characterize these soil surfaces at the moment. So there's a lot of work going on from NASA to make these maps and improve them, particularly in terms of this biogeochemistry problem. So from a human point of view, from the fossil fuel burning, again, it's a mineralogical point of view that's taken, but this time we're interested in that content of the minerals in the different types of fuels which are burnt at different temperatures. So main fuels are coal, oil, and wood in terms of the fossil fuels. And here we have different types of combustion which happen at different temperatures. In general, oil is very high of sulfate, iron sulfates. They're highly, highly labile, so that's very, very bioaccessible. While coal and woods at normal kind of processes have a high amount of hematite, which is this locked up, bound up in the iron oxide form, which is less soluble. So what we find is that if you have a lot of oil burning as compared to coal or wood burning, then in fact you're going to end up with a lot more bioaccessible, bioavailable iron. That's interesting because ships use the dirty kind of oil, and they're also right next to the ocean. So the amount of iron which is coming out from the ships, which is being deposited right next to it, it can end up being quite an important source of iron to the oceans, as well as things like general fossil fuel burning. And then finally, from the fires, we care about where the fires are occurring. So here we've got a picture of the satellite-defined burn area as a fraction of each grid cell that burns every year. And then what we can do is black carbon, so the smoke, the soot part of that is well characterized by these estimates from things like the GFED, which is this one here, the Global Fire Emission Data Set. And then we can relate that to iron using ratios from observations which have been taken in different types of biomes. So for example, here we can see like for grassland and for forest fires, we have a look at the ratio of iron to black carbon. In general, we may have a kind of a similar actual mean amount and median amount between the two different biomes, but there's more of a spread in the forests. The smoldering phase, which is a lower combustion phase, has a little bit more iron than the hotter phase. But what we really actually end up using is this fine to coarse, which is the size range of the particles. And you can see here that they're very, very, very different. You get a lot more iron in this larger particle phase from wildfires than in the smaller phase. And we'll come back to that later as to why that might be the case. So once you put that all into the model, you represent all of those different processes, all those different sources, you can then end up with an emission trajectory over time, and that's what that looks like here. So we're going from 1980 through to 2015, and we've got the total amount of iron emissions in the top and the soluble amount of iron emissions in the bottom. And we can see once again here that dust is dominating. It's about 2 orders of magnitude more iron in dust than there are from wildfires or combustion, which is in red and blue. But for that soluble phase, again, that's the bioaccessible phase here, that difference is much, much reduced, which is why we say we're very, very interested in these particular sources. Over time, fires and dust have not changed very much, but there's been this slow, steady increase in anthropogenic emissions as anthropogenic activity is ramping up. For anybody who's interested, there's all of the nitty-gritty details on the right-hand side there, but I won't go into that now, just to see that this is the kind of temporal patterns that we're looking at over the last 35 years. So once it's emitted into the atmosphere, we then want to represent that increase in bioavailability with time. And this looks something, can look a little bit like this. This is actually from an observational point of view here. So we have an initial amount of solubility in your iron on the black here, and then we have distance traveled with time. And you can see with time that solubility is increasing. And that's to do with the fact that the pH of the aerosol is getting more acidic. So with time, that pH is reducing. So you can see here that relationship between aerosol acidity and bioavailable fraction of ion. So we incorporate that into the model as well, so that with time, the aerosol will become more bioavailable. And then overall, what you end up with is this reverse hyperbolic relationship, which is well characterized in the field data of ion solubility, so the fraction of that ion which is soluble, bioavailable, to the total ion concentration. So at very low concentrations, you have a high solubility, and at very high concentrations, you tend to have a very low ion solubility. The lovely thing about a model is that when you're doing that and you can look at these different sources and the contribution of those different sources to that pattern, we can then start to tease out a pattern here. And what we're seeing actually is that at these lower concentrations, we're seeing a much, much higher contribution of the combustion sources, so that's our wildfires and our fossil fuel burning sources, to the total, whereas at these much higher ion concentrations, we're seeing more of the dust contribution. So we were able to pass out this importance, once again, of the sources in terms of their profiles. So that's the change in the aerosol through its transport. And then finally, once it's deposited to the ocean, what does that look like, and what ion from what particular sources is ending up where? So this plot takes a little bit of explanation just to get your head round. But what we're looking at here is that same simulation from 1980 to 2015 that I showed here of the emissions. So this simulation here. And we're looking at its deposition patterns to different ocean basins. So what we can do is we can characterize, first of all, what ocean basins we're interested in looking at. And it turns out, in fact, that there's 4 main ocean basin regions of the world which can be characterized by the amount of aerosol which is being deposited to them from different sources. And then here we're looking at that deposition in each month of the year over the evolution of that 35 years. So this point here, for example, for the dust, that would be the 1980 deposition in January, and then you're moving through time here to the 2015 deposition value in January from the dust. So that gives you an idea of the change and the trend over both time in the course of the year, the seasonality, as well as through time and for every single month of the year. So it's a way to kind of put a lot of information onto one plot. You can see that those regions, these 2 regions here, which are downwind of the main desert regions, unsurprisingly, are being dominated by that dust input of the ion. But interestingly here, region 3 and region 4, so region 3 is the North Pacific and some of the regions around the maritime region here, and also the Southern Ocean region. And these are the regions which have a high content of that high nutrient, low chlorophyll regions in them. So they are the regions that we're caring about in terms of the biota response. Actually, they have a very different pattern compared to the ones away from the dust regions. Again, dust can be the dominant one, particularly in Asia in springtime or here outside of the wildfire burning region. But during high fire season in the southern hemisphere in particular, the fires are actually contributing more of the amount of iron which is being deposited to the Southern Ocean than dust. And here, the blue line, that's the anthropogenic one. We can really see, particularly for Asia, that really strong increase here in the amount of iron which is being contributed from that source. And in some cases, it's actually beginning to start to outstrip the amount of iron which is coming from dust. And if you add the 2 together, you end up with the purple line. And again, that's starting to become it's becoming the dominant source outside of springtime for the deposition there. So thinking about that trend, we can ask the question, okay, so is human activity therefore spinning this iron cycle, the Ferris wheel, faster? This was an attempt to kind of consider and conceptualize some of the different processes which are important here. So we have climate change, land use change, anthropogenic emissions, all kind of working together to alter human activity's perturbation of the iron cycle. So I wanted to explore that, and this time we're looking at 3 different time periods, and I coupled the emission fluxes to an ocean biogeochemistry model to see what the impacts would be. So here's our original schematic that we saw at the beginning of the talk. And I'm looking at 3 different time periods: the pre-industrial time period, 1750, today, 2008, and then at the end of the century in future. Here's all of the information that was used in these simulations to first of all generate the change in the flux, so how much extra or less iron is being deposited to the ocean at each of these time periods depending on climate change, all of these different aspects in increasing anthropogenic activity and impacts on wildfires, and then thinking about what response that would have in the biogeochemical cycle. So we ended up with a range of different emissions down here. You don't really need to pay attention to those, but if we're just thinking about each different source, here we can see whether it was an increase or a decrease over change from present day to pre-industrial or for the future compared to present day over time, and then what that means for the amount of iron which was deposited to the ocean. We can see there's a very large spread in the emissions and their deposition amount, but in general what we end up with is that there is less iron in the pre-industrial and slightly more iron being deposited to the ocean in the future. We can look at that by basin, which is shown here. So we're looking here at the current present day compared to the pre-industrial. See there's a large increase in the northern hemisphere, which is being driven by industrialization. So that's our burning of the fossil fuels. Very large decrease in the southern hemisphere in terms of the amount of iron which is being deposited. And that's due to fires being a lot lower in the present day than they were in the past, which is driving that very large decrease. And then if we flip it and we look out to the future, so the 2100 change compared to present day, we can see that that pattern reverses. So we now have a northern hemisphere decrease. That's overall being driven by the conceptualization of pollution control acts reducing down now how much anthropogenic fossil fuel burning there is, whereas in the reverse, in the southern hemisphere, we have a lot more fire. So that's what's driving that. So we're ending up with a different scale of pattern depending on whether we're looking backwards or whether we're looking forwards in time from the present day. So what does that mean in terms of the biogeochemistry? So one of the first things we had to look at was, would it change the spatial scale of the iron limitation? So what we're looking at here is from 1750, so from the past through to the future, we have the iron limitation as modeled by a biogeochemistry model in the CESM, and then we're looking at, in the crosses, that's where there is a change in that distribution, where it's moving away from iron limitation, either towards nitrogen limitation or towards phosphorus limitation. And we can see that, yes, there is actually quite a large change in the spatial areal extent of limitation, where we are reducing down in the future iron limitation, and we may be potentially be increasing the area of nitrogen or phosphorus limitation. In terms of the actual biogeochemistry itself that's going on within the water column, there's various different parts that we can look at. Here I'm just focusing in on the carbon cycle aspects. So here we have, again, here's the changes that were modeled in terms of the soluble iron flux today compared to the past, future compared to today on a fractional scale here. And here's our change in the biogeochemistry. We have net primary productivity, the diatom fraction compared to the smaller phytoplankton community fraction, and then the export production, so how much CO2 is being lost to the ocean depths. If we have a look across both time frames across net primary productivity, in fact, actually the model is simulating that even though we're perturbing the amount of soluble iron flux to the ocean by quite a lot, there isn't actually much of a response within this particular modeling scenario. However, what is interesting is that although the net primary productivity itself may be rather insensitive to that change, the community structure is not, and it is really changing quite a lot. And what we're ending up with in many regions is a lot more diatoms, so they're larger, they're heavier, and that then corresponds to, in fact, an increased export of carbon dioxide away from the atmosphere through the biological pump because of that change in community structure. So although there's only a small amount of net primary productivity change, you can still end up with a much larger export change because of what's actually happening to the community. But there are also decreases as well, and often those decreases are actually related to the increases. They are within the same kind of region, this kind of equatorial Pacific region, and we're seeing some very, very large reductions as well away from those increases. And that's to do with the changing spatial patterns of the amount of macronutrients which are available to drive productivity. So you can imagine here we've got the equatorial Pacific, so that's the upwelling zones. We have all of the nutrients being upwelled to the surface. And then along that region here, which is iron limited, you add more iron from the atmosphere, you're going to end up with a much larger uptake, much larger productivity, which is going to uptake the phosphorus and uptake the nitrogen. But if you uptake it along that barrier region, along the equatorial region, then as those nutrients kind of move laterally outwards, they're no longer available. So all you're doing is you're swapping where the productivity is happening rather than the overall amount of productivity. So further away, you then get a decrease in the amount of uptake of nitrogen and phosphorus because it's simply just not there anymore because it's been taken up along the upwelling region. So if you then integrate across the basin scale, what you end up with is in fact that the productivity didn't change, you just changed where it was actually happening. That is not the same for the Southern Ocean because it's not the same characteristics of what's happening to the nutrients, but for the equatorial Pacific, it's very important to consider the basin scale impact rather than these smaller scale impacts, which I think is quite important when we're thinking back earlier to those observations and the way that they're taken on a much smaller scale. So kind of coupling that small scale understanding in the observations to this larger scale basin scale understanding that we can get from the models, I think is very important when we're thinking about trying to understand the overall impact of changes in biogeochemistry as mediated by aerosol deposition. So there's another way that you can look at this. Instead of like changing the amount of deposition through time, we can use the model to perturb the sensitivity of the deposition due to uncertainties in the actual flux itself. So we have uncertainty in how much fire there was, we have an uncertainty in how much dust there is, we have an uncertainty in how much burning we have. And we can then add a extreme scenario where we take how much we think we have as our best estimate, and we can run a second simulation where we have a high estimate, and we can look at what the impact then is if we increase one of these sources only. And that's what's shown here in this particular graph here. On the left-hand side, we have our carbon cycle responses here. We also have some nitrogen cycle responses across 3 different ocean basins, which are part of HNLC regions. And I don't want you to worry too much about the details here, but the interesting thing that we found within this study when we did this is that the global carbon export efficiency we found to be 9 times stronger when we increased the amount of fire iron deposited in the model compared to the amount of dust iron. At the very same time, as often happens in science, I think, another group was actually working on exactly the same question. They weren't looking at it or expecting to find this either, but they came up with a very similar number, a factor of 6 in their study, which kind of collaborated what we were finding in ours. That's a totally different independent study with another model, came up with a very, very similar number. And it's something that we weren't looking for, but certainly came out of these results, suggesting that for every gram of iron which you deposit to the ocean, which is coming from fires, you're going to have a much, much larger response in the biogeochemical pump as compared to dust. Again, kind of fueling this research idea that we need to think beyond dust as an aerosol nutrient source and particularly consider wildfires. That brings me to the third and final part of the talk, wildfires as an aerosol nutrient source, where it is and why it might be interesting. So here's a broad overview of the results that I was just showing you here. Basically, the fires can help drive the nitrogen response in the Pacific, but it's in the Southern Ocean part of the world. We're really very interested in the fires from Australia, South Africa, and South America, because they're really driving that global carbon cycle response through the Southern Ocean, and particularly because of that much higher efficiency they have in driving the biological pump. So do we have any evidence beyond the model world that this actually might be true, or is this am I sitting in model land here kind of without any any extra evidence. So if we have a look back to this original plot that I was showing earlier, which is all the bioassay experiments. So here they have had a look at different sources and what those different sources, their impacts on the chlorophyll. If you notice, it's mineral dust, we've got anthropogenic, and we've got volcanic. There is no wildfire experiment which has actually been undertaken. Wildfire ash smoke hasn't been done yet. Well, at that time hasn't been done. In fact, actually, there's some research going on with the Thomas Fire in California, which we can now potentially add a dot here. But if we think about dust as compared to its other sources anyway, all of the experiments that used a dust source did have a much lower impact than these combustion sources in terms of the chlorophyll response. In fact, the anthropogenic sources induced a chlorophyll response which is approximately 50% larger on average than the dust source. So there is some potential evidence here that other sources beyond dust can be much more important in terms of productivity enhancement. But when we're thinking about what I'm saying here as well as fire iron, what am I actually saying when I mean that, when we're actually talking about that? Is it the stuff which is coming from the fires, or is there more to the story? So what we're looking at here is a schematic which shows the evolution of a fire through the landscape, through its point of ignition, to its full recovery over here on the right-hand side, so from seconds through to potentially up to years. And what I'm illustrating is that, in fact, the iron which is in that smoke is a product of two different things. It's a product of the vegetation itself. There's iron within that vegetation that it's taken up to use for its own productivity. But the heat, that pyroconvection, it sucks up the soils around it into the smoke plume. So what we're actually looking at here is a mixture of both vegetation and the entrainment of the soils from the local environment. Also, interestingly, once the fire has removed the vegetation, you now have a bare landscape. So that landscape itself is then more susceptible to the dust erosion and uplift. So you end up with a higher amount of dust being emitted over time. So there's a legacy effect as well. It's not just the fire, but there's also this legacy effect which will become important in a minute. So we can have a little look to try and characterize that, and what it ends up being in terms of the iron is that approximately 2/3 of the iron, in fact, in the smoke plume is in fact coming from that entrainment. So it is actually really important to consider not just how much smoke, how much vegetation was being consumed, but its local environment too as well. And recently there was a study out in Nature which was showing that in fact 1 in 2 large fires are followed by this large dust enhancement as well. So they looked over all of the satellite record and explored, I think it was like 200,000 different fires, and they found that this happens very frequently as well. And this helps to explain, as I said earlier, this difference here. So soil particles, dust particles are larger than the combustion particle of the vegetation. So this helps to explain why, in fact, when we're looking at these ratios of the amount of smoke, the black carbon, which is coming from the burning of the vegetation itself, to that iron fraction, why we end up with this very large difference in the fractions. And it's most likely due to the fact that these large particles, as we're seeing here, are the ones which are being entrained from the local environment. So finally, I want to finish up with a case study which really does help to kind of bring all of these things together in terms of the fires. So let's grab some water first. The Australian megafire in the summer of 2019-2020 was exceptional, without a doubt. It removed at least 20% of the broadleaf and temperate forests from Australia, had devastating impacts on the local ecosystems and the people living along the eastern boundary of Australia. And here we're looking at some satellite images of that fire itself. And underneath here, we can see, here's Australia, here's a smoke plume coming out, showing what we were looking at a little bit earlier as well in the Aerosol video from NASA. You kind of see it characterized here, a very clear, dense amount of aerosol particles being transported away from Australia, and it's going to be dumped into the South Pacific. So what the authors Tang et al. Did is that they wanted to see if that deposition of that nutrients had an impact on the biota of the Southern Ocean. And here we're looking at the satellite-derived chlorophyll A in that summer compared to the climatology. And you can see that, yes, in fact, there was a very large phytoplankton bloom at the same time as the deposition of that aerosol to the ocean surface. What I particularly like about this study is that they didn't just rely on the satellites as well. There was also Argo floats out at the time, so they were able to doubly verify that, in fact, yes, there was a response, and by using in situ experiments as well as remote sensing, which really helps to make their result quite robust. This phytoplankton bloom itself, well, I think it's actually the combination of the two of them, is actually larger in size, aerial size, than Australia, to give you a sense of the scale of this productivity increase. So then they characterized what that might mean for the productivity. So here's, in the orange bars, we have over the wildfire season, the amount of productivity, and the climatology in the blue for each month of the year. And on approximately, for each month, it ends up being about 20% more productivity due to that deposition of that smoke aerosol with its nutrients in it. And you can also then change that productivity into export potential, how much CO2, and you end up with the same number again. It's about 20% more during the wildfire season, export potential, compared to how much would normally be occurring. And what I think is really interesting, but should be taken absolutely with a grain of salt and needs a lot more work, I think, before we can come to any definite conclusions, but is tantalizing nonetheless. The amount of carbon emitted from the forest fire is approximately the amount of carbon which was sequestered by the phytoplankton. So equal and opposite, the amount of carbon which was coming up with the amount of carbon which was taken down. If true, that requires a real rethinking of the way that we think about global carbon budgeting, particularly in a world where more extreme fire events and more fire in general is going to become more of the norm rather than the exception. So this also links back potentially to what I was showing earlier. From the modeling point of view, I think it does help to collaborate the fact that fire iron, yes, could be important and maybe having an important feedback through the Earth system. The other interesting component of this isn't just the magnitude, but its duration. That's a very large bloom, the size of Australia, and it hung around for up to 9 months. So that's another question. Why would it do that? The fire itself didn't last for 9 months. The fire wasn't burning for 9 months. So how did we end up with this huge bloom which stayed for 3/4 of a year? So the authors here, White et al., had a look at that component of the question. And what they found was it's a two-component problem. First of all, the size of the bloom allowed for efficient recycling within the area of the bloom itself. So it was able to stay around through recycling, through the food web in particular. But the second part was, and it's to do with this here, so you have the initial fertilization effect because of the fire. But periodically, they were seeing that there was small intrusions of extra dust. And what that was doing was just kind of topping itself up. So it had this ability to recycle, but as the numbers were kind of coming down and the amount of iron available for productivity was reducing, we still had this legacy effect of the fire, which was increasing these dust intrusions, which was then kind of topping itself back up again. So this overall integrated impact of the fire on the ecosystem was also helping to maintain this for such a long time. So in summary, if you don't take away anything else from the talk, take away that dust does dominate the input of iron to the oceans, particularly downward of desert regions. However, fires and anthropogenic components cannot be discounted. There's a lot of work from other groups working on the anthropogenic combustion component. Hopefully, I've made you interested in this fire component here today. And particularly in an increasingly warming world where we're seeing increased fire activity, what does that mean for ocean biogeochemistry? I'm coming at it from the atmospheric point of view. It's wonderful to come here today and meet some folk who are probably hopefully looking at this from the ocean point of view, because we absolutely cannot be considering this one without the other, okay? Like, as we saw earlier, sometimes you would have a deposition event, but there just wouldn't be a response. So understanding the characteristics of the receiving ocean as well as the community that is living within it is as important as characterizing the change in the deposition events itself. Beyond biogeochemistry, though, this question of iron and how much iron is being emitted to the atmosphere, and other metals, in fact, not just iron, is important for many different topics of science as well. For example, health impacts. Iron itself, if you get it in your lungs, is very nasty, but also potentially cyanobacteria. What happens if you end up fertilizing those over other phytoplankton types? While in the atmosphere, it has some interactions as well, can impact all sorts of different climate states. And I'm very much interested in hearing your ideas about other particular communities who might also be interested in understanding some of the impacts of iron and particularly thinking beyond just biogeochemistry, what other communities might we be able to work with to help them and also illuminate potentially more about this problem. And I'll just leave it there and welcome any questions. Thanks.